Hello and welcome. Happy Friday. I hope everyone is having an amazing start to the weekend. And thank you for joining me for part 3 of my Neville lecture series. For those of you who may be joining or seeing this for the first time, I am creating a 5-part series going over Neville Goddard's 5 lessons and sort of breaking down and decoding, so to speak, translating the messages of the Bible and the messages of Neville that he was aiming to share. I've had a lot of people request this series and request that I do these kinds of breakdowns just so we have a better idea, we have clarity as to what we need to be doing here and the points and emphasis that Neville taught. Because he can be very difficult to understand and difficult to read, it's maybe confusing to try to do it through just reading through yourself, especially if English is not your first language. So that is where I am here to assist and guide. And I also feel this is especially important because, especially nowadays, with an overwhelming amount of information out there, a lot of his core message is getting lost in translation. So if you want to check out part 1 and 2, I will have that linked in the description box below, along with all 5 of his lessons, his 5-lesson, the whole manuscript, a link that you can go check out. You can read along for free, but definitely be sure to take notes, grab a pen and paper. This video is going to be a little bit longer than my normal videos because there is a lot to go over and dissect. And how I'm going to be doing this, as per my last 2, I'm going to be going back and forth between screen sharing and reading a few excerpts and then coming back to full screen and sort of breaking down the important things to note. I'm not going to be going word for word, as that would probably take me a few hours. This video would be very, very long in that case. But I will be covering as much ground as I can. And I do hope you guys enjoy. This week, lesson 3, thinking 4th dimensionally. And as I mentioned last week in my part 2, this is arguably the most important lesson. I would say this and lesson 4, changing the feeling of I, but this is especially important to note when it comes to thinking 4th dimensionally, what that means, the 3rd dimensional self and the 4th dimensional self, all of that distinction. I'm going to go ahead and break it down. So without further ado, and don't mind my cat in the background. Oh, that guy over there. He's just going to be hanging out, causing trouble. But without further ado, let's go ahead and share this screen and jump on in. Lesson 3, thinking 4th dimensionally. There are 2 actual outlooks on the world possessed by every man. And the ancient storytellers were fully conscious of these 2 outlooks. They called the one the carnal mind, and the other the mind of Christ. We recognize these 2 centers of thought in the statement. The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. To the natural mind, reality is confined to the instant called now. This very moment seems to contain the whole of reality. Everything else is unreal. To the natural mind, the past and the future are purely imaginary. In other words, my past, when I use the natural mind, is only a memory image of things that were. And to the limited focus of the carnal or natural mind, the future does not exist. The natural mind does not believe that it could revisit the past and see it as something that is present, something that is objective and concrete to itself. Neither does it believe that the future exists. To the Christ mind, the spiritual mind, which is in our language we will call the 4th dimensional focus, the past, the present, and the future of the natural mind are a present whole. It takes in the entire array of sensory impressions that man has encountered, is encountering, and will encounter. The only reason you and I are functioning as we are today and are not aware of the greater outlook is simply because we are creatures of habit. And habit renders us totally blind to what otherwise we should see. But habit is not law. It acts as though it were the most compelling force in the world, yet it is not law. We can create a new approach to life. If you and I would spend a few minutes every day in withdrawing our attention from the region of sensation and concentrating it on an invisible state, and remain faithful to this contemplation, feeling and sensing the reality of an invisible state, we would, in time, become aware of this greater world, this dimensionally larger world. The state contemplated is now a concrete reality, displaced in time. Tonight, as we turn to our Bible, you be the judge as to where you stand in your present unfoldment. Whew. So right off the bat, I know that may have been a lot. But getting straight to the point, Neville is talking about we have two minds that we are using or capable of using: the natural mind, or the carnal mind, and the spiritual mind, or the mind of Christ. And for the in reference to this, into this lesson, he calls it the fourth dimensional mind. So with the carnal mind, the natural mind, that is our human limitation. That is our three-dimensional focus, how we perceive things. Basically, it's the mind of man. We see everything in this present moment as real as far as the senses are concerned, and the past and the future don't exist, or it's all make-believe. But in the spiritual mind, in the fourth dimensional mind, all of the past, present, future exists in this infinitely greater space, this greater dimension. And everything that we have perceived, are perceiving, will perceive, so everything past, present, and future is available for us to experience right now. So what he's trying to get across here is that when we're using the natural mind, or the very limited thinking mind of man, we have a very limited focus, and it very limited to what we believe and what we can experience. We have these obstacles, we have these barriers, perceived barriers. When we have the spiritual mind, or the fourth dimensional focus, then we can experience anything that we want. There are no limitations. Then he goes on to explain that the only reason that we are where we are today, why we are experiencing what we have today as our circumstances, is because we are creatures of habit. And this is something that I've talked about as well. Habit is a compelling force. This is why it can seem incredibly difficult for us to create the change and maintain the change that we want and desire to have. We want to be different. We want our circumstances to be different. But because we are so moved by habit, it can feel incredibly difficult to transcend that, to move past that. But he goes on to assure you that even though habit can feel like a law, it can feel like, it is enforced and it is compelling. Habit is not law. Habit can be changed. And we can create a new approach to life. If we would just spend a few minutes every day removing our attention from the senses, from the circumstances, from everything we're perceiving with the limited mind, the natural mind, if we can just spend a little bit of time every day just removing the attention from that, and placing it on the invisible states in the spiritual mind, we can see things radically change. So we're going to go ahead and continue. Just as a note, I am going to sort of not going to be delving into the stories of the Bible, because Neville goes on to share a few stories from the Bible, as he did in the previous lessons, all in reference and sort of backing what he is trying to say here. And this week's particular, he's talking about the three-dimensional focus, or the limited thinking mind, versus fourth-dimensional focus, or the larger spiritual mind, that mind of Christ. And he gives some stories from the Bible to sort of break down the metaphors and explain what that means in reference to this. So I'm not going to be kind of digging too deep into that, because again, this will be a very, very long video. But I do encourage everybody to click down on the link in the description box, read over it. Every story of the Bible is allegory. It's metaphor. All of the people of the Bible represent states of consciousness in man. It's basically the blueprint to our development. So, but I do want to really highlight and emphasize a few points that he makes in each of these stories. So in the first story, he talks about, I believe it's the Gospel of Mark, 5th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. You are, this very night, as you are seated here, pictured in this 5th chapter of Mark. A cemetery is for one purpose. It is simply a record of the dead. Are you living in the dead past? If you are living among the dead, your prejudice, your superstitions, and your false beliefs that you keep alive are the tombstones behind which you hide. If you refuse to let them go, you are just as mad as the madman of the Bible, who pleaded with the enlightened reason not to cast them out. There is no difference. But enlightened reason is incapable of protecting prejudice and superstition against the inroads of reason. There is not a man in this world who has a prejudice, regardless of the nature of the prejudice, who can hold it up to a light of reason. Tell me you are against a certain nation, a certain race, a certain ism, a certain anything. I do not care what it is. You cannot expose that belief of yours to the light of reason and have it live. In order that it may be kept alive in your world, you must hide it from reason. You cannot analyze it in the light of reason and have it live. When this fourth dimensional focus comes and shows you a new approach to life, and casts out of your own mind all these things that bedeviled you, you are cleansed and closed in your right mind. And you sit at the foot of understanding, called the feet of the master. So quite simply here, Neville is saying that, in this story, it is referencing the dead past and our human ability and natural instinct to keep alive all of these prejudices, our old beliefs, our old assumptions. And he's saying here, look, no matter what your beliefs, no matter what the old ism is, if you try to hold it up to the light, it will fall apart. It will not stand the light of reason. Because when we really start to observe it from the place of being more objective, we'll see that our old beliefs and assumptions really are not that sound, and they cannot hold any weight, and they become very, very, very bendable and breakable, to say the least. So he's also saying, like, what we need to do is make sure that we're not living in the dead past. Are you living in the dead past? Are you living in your old fears and superstitions and beliefs? Are you keeping alive the old man, so to speak? We need to be mindful of these things. In this story, Jesus is the awakened intellect of man. When your mind functions outside of the range of your present senses, when your mind is healed of all former limitations, then you are no longer the insane man, but you are this presence personified as Jesus, the power that can resurrect the longings of the heart of man. So Jesus is in every story the allegory there is the enlightenment, the awakened man. That is your Christ mind. That is your knowing who you really are. So Jesus in every story is just that. It's the personification of your enlightened state. As your mind is cleansed of your former concept of self, you assume you are what you want to be, and, remaining faithful to this assumption, you give form to your assumption or resurrect your child. You are the woman cleansed of the issue of blood, and you move towards the house of the dead child. Now, again, I know all of this sounds really weird, but this is all allegory, and he's just breaking down the allegory. I do highly recommend learning to read through the stories of the Bible, as Neville talks about, and as he sort of breaks down in translation, because all it is, as you come to find, is our journey. It is our journey from being Adam, who is dead asleep, basically our unconscious self, who we were before we knew about any of this, the journey from Adam to Christ, and that is being fully awakened to who we actually are. The child or state you desired is now your fixed concept of yourself. But now, having assumed that I am what formerly I desired to be, I cannot continue desiring what I am conscious of being. So I do not discuss it. I talk to no one concerning what I am. It is so obvious to me that I am what I wanted to be that I walk as though I were. So I want to talk about this part really quick, because there's a few important things to note. So again, he's talking about we have to be dead and buried from the past. All of the old superstitions, all of the old beliefs, all of the old what ifs, all of the fears, the doubts, all of the limitations, we must be dead and buried to them. Or are we living in that dead past? Are we continuing to keep ourselves in that old state? So we cannot continue desiring what we are conscious of being. So the idea here is that as you become your new concept of self, as your mind is cleansed of your former concept of self, you are naturally assuming that which you desire to be. So you're no longer able to desire something or want something from that new state, of that new self-concept. So this is the point that gets emphasized over and over again. And Neville is very, very clear and very repetitive of the fact that this is not surface rearrangement. This is not us just trying to get something to change on the outside. This is about a transformation of self. That is the only way to the kingdom of heaven. Let's continue. Walking as though I am what formerly I wanted to be, my world of limited focus does not see it and thinks I no longer desire it. The child is dead within their world, but I, who know the law, say, the child is not dead. The damsel is not dead, she but sleepeth. I now awaken her. I, by my assumption, awaken and make visible in my world what I assume. For assumptions, if sustained, invariably awaken what they affirm. Assumptions harden into fact, as we discussed last week. I close the door. What door? The door of my senses. I simply shut out completely all that my senses reveal. I deny the evidence of my senses. I suspend the limited reason of the natural man and walk in this bold assertion that I am what my senses deny. Completely denying the evidence of the senses. And once again, this is something that we hear about, but often overlook. We tend to slight the important things. When we talk about, stop for a second because this one's important. When we talk about denying the senses, when we talk about shutting out the 3D world, that isn't us trying to ignore it. That isn't us trying to lie to ourselves or pretend like it doesn't exist. We're not literally acting like an actor. We're not spending a whole bunch of money that we don't have in 3D because we're trying to pretend to be rich or anything of that sort. And I need to make that point abundantly clear. Neville also goes on to talk about this, but one way that we can really get mixed up is that we're basically trying to lie to ourselves or deceive ourselves, and God cannot be mocked. We cannot deceive ourselves. So this is when we talk about shutting out the senses, we're literally just saying that although everything looks the way that it does, although the circumstances are what they are in this present moment, if I remain faithful to what I am assuming now and what I am imagining, what I am being internally in my mind, if I can keep my attention and focus on being that, despite what's taking place around me, then the outside will have to conform to what I am feeling and what I am imagining and assuming in here. So I just need to make that abundantly clear because it's often gets confused. Let's continue. You be the judge. I cannot judge you. You are either living now in the dead past, or you are living as the woman whose issue of blood has been stanched. Could you actually answer me if I asked you the question? And this is important. Neville says, do you believe now that you, without the assistance of another, need only to assume that you are what you want to be, to make that assumption real within your world? Or do you believe that you must fulfill a certain condition imposed upon you by the past, that you must be of a certain order or a certain something? He goes on to talk about different churches and different beliefs that we're limited by, but I would take it a step further and say, are we conditioning our desires? Do we really believe right now that we could be whatever we want to be, we can have whatever we want to have without the assistance of another, without lifting a finger? Or do we believe that we have to fulfill a condition? Do we have to do a certain thing in order for it to be so? Are we conditioning what we desire? Do we really believe that all we need to do is assume it? Or do I think that I need to take some kind of action for it? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. That's going to point us to our faith. That's going to point us to what we are naturally assuming and believing. And a lot of times the answer is no, we don't believe that all we have to do is assume. It sounds way too good to be true. It sounds way too simple. And it is deceiving, but that is all that's needed. We do not need to impose any kind of condition by the past or believe that we have to fulfill a certain order or that we have to do a certain thing in order to get what we want. If you believe that you must be one of these in order to be saved, you are still an insane man hiding behind these superstitions and these prejudices of the past, and you are begging not to be cleansed. Basically, he's saying if you are conditioning your desires, you're keeping yourself stuck in your past. And by that, you're keeping yourself stuck in your old state. Some of you say to me, do not ask me to give up my belief in Jesus the man, or in Moses the man. or in Peter, the man. When you ask me to give up my belief in these characters, you are asking too much. Leave me these beliefs because they comfort me. I can believe that they lived upon earth and still follow your psychological interpretation of their stories. I say, come out of the dead past. Come out of the cemetery and walk, knowing that you and your Father are one. And your Father, whom men call God, is your own consciousness. That is the only creative law in the world. Of what are you conscious of being? Although you cannot see your objective with the limited focus of your three-dimensional mind, you are now that which you have assumed you are. Walk in that assumption and remain faithful to it. Time in this dimension of your being beats slowly, and you may not, even after you objectify your assumption, remember there was a time when this present reality was but an attitude of mind. Because of the slowness of the beat of time, here you often fail to see the relationship between your inner nature and the outer world that bears witness to it. This is super important, so let's discuss. What Neville is first saying here, some of his followers would come up to him and say, Neville, don't make me give up my beliefs in Jesus as somebody who lived 2,000 years ago. Don't say I have to give up my old beliefs. It brings me comfort. And I can still interpret your teachings even with these comforts. And what Neville's saying here is, come out of the dead past. Come out of the cemetery and walk, knowing that you and your Father are one. Basically, what Neville's saying is, give up your old beliefs. Give up your old superstitions. Give up your old, synchronicities and fears and doubts and all of the things that you once perceived as true. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. Of what are you conscious of being? Who are you conscious of? Are you conscious of your old thought patterns? Are you conscious of the old reactions? Do you still have the same story ruminating in the background? You are now that which you have assumed you are. And then he goes on to talk about time. And this part's important. Really, really important, because this is usually where we struggle. Time in this dimension of your being beats slowly. And you may not, even after you objectify your assumption, remember that there was a time when this present reality was but an attitude of mind. So what he's saying here is that oftentimes we do not put the pieces together or connect the dots of when something is impressed subconsciously and outpictured. We often fail to see the relationship between the inner nature and the outer world, what bears witness to it. So we're failing to see the relationship between the inner world and the outer experiences. And Neville's saying that we do need to be more mindful of that. Due to linear time and things moving slower, we often miss this. And it's why when things show up for us, it can seem like a fluke or coincidence, because we're not remembering when we left that impression. We don't remember when we planted that seed, because we do often fail to see the relationship because we're not being as observant as we want to be. And let's continue. Turns to another story in the Bible, the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John. And this is another story that Neville talks about two distinct outlooks in this world. One of the limited 3-dimensional focus, and the other the 4th-dimensional focus. So again, this story is going to be the allegory that defines the limitations of the 3rd-dimensional focus, the natural mind, the thinking mind of man, and our 4th-dimensional focus, or the spiritual mind, the greater mind. In this story, you need no man to put you in the pool as your consciousness is disturbed by the desire. All you need to do is assume you are already that which formerly you wanted to be, and you are in it, and no man can get in before you. What man can get in before you when you become conscious of being that which you want to be? No one can be before you when you already possess the power to say, I am. So once again, here he's saying that you do not need to wait on anything. You do not need to put any conditions before you. You do not need to say, oh, I can't have what I want because I'm not qualified or because I'm not good enough. I don't have enough money for it. Like, all of these reasons why we cannot have what we want, we need to do away with all of that. You are now what your senses would deny. Are you bold enough to assume that you are already that which you want to be? If you dare assume you are already that which your reason and your senses now deny, then you are in the pool and, unaided by man, you too will rise and take your couch and walk. So again, all of this is allegory. The pool is consciousness. That is your conscious awareness. You are told it happened on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is only the mystical sense of stillness, when you are unconcerned, when you are not anxious, when you are not looking for results, knowing that signs follow and do not precede. The Sabbath is the day of stillness, wherein there is no working. When you are not working to make it so, you are in the Sabbath. When you are not at all concerned about the opinions of others. When you walk as though you were, you cannot raise one finger to make it so. You are in the Sabbath. I cannot be concerned as to how it will be, and still say, I am conscious of being it. If I am conscious of being free, secure, healthy, and happy, I sustain these states of consciousness without effort or labor on my part. Therefore, I am in the Sabbath. And because it was the Sabbath, he rose and walked. So I've made videos talking about the Sabbath, in the esoteric sense, in the metaphysical sense, and that is the day of stillness, the day of rest. The Sabbath is when we are unbothered. It is when we are not worried about it. We are not constantly thinking about it. We are not trying to work to make it so. It's the day of rest, when you are not at all concerned, despite the circumstances, despite anything going on out here. When you are unmoved and unbothered and moisturized in your lane, that's when you are in the Sabbath. Next story, 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. And I do have a book recommendation for those who are interested in learning the metaphysics of the Bible, learning the esoteric meaning of the words of the Bible. So I will be sure to talk more about that. Or if you guys are interested, let me know, drop some comments, and I will leave a link. Leave a link to it. This is where we talk about the harvest. Yep. So in this story, the woman of Samaria is the 3-dimensional you, and Jesus at the well is the 4th-dimensional you. The argument starts between what you want to be and what reason tells you you are. The greater you tells you that if you would dare assume you are already what you want to be, you would become it. The lesser you, with its limited focus, tells you why you haven't a bucket, you haven't a rope, and the well is deep. How could you ever reach the depth of this state without the means to that end? You answer and say, if you only knew who asks of you to drink, you would ask of him. If you only knew what in yourself is urging upon you the embodiment of the state you now seek, you would suspend your little sight and let him do it for you. Basically, if we only knew the power of I am, if we only knew the power of our highest self, and that the desire is a gift from the highest self that we are meant to experience, if we only knew this and we trusted this, we would let it happen. We would happily surrender to that feeling state and allow things to unfold for us. But the limited senses, the limited thinking mind, the carnal mind or the natural mind is always thinking, but what about this? But what about that? You don't have the resources for it. You don't have enough this or enough that. And Jesus is saying, doesn't matter. If only you knew what you were capable of, if you let your highest self move through you and allow it to unfold naturally for you. Because it will, if we allow it. And Neville goes on to talk about in the story, the 5 husbands is your 5 senses, your 5 physical senses, and how we are basically being impregnated by these 5 husbands or 5 senses all throughout the day. What you would like to be is denied by these 5, and they hold the power. They dictate what you will accept as true. What you would like to accept has not yet penetrated your mind and impregnated your mind with its reality. He whom you call husband is really not your husband. You are not bearing his likeness. To bear his likeness is proof that you are his wife. At least you have known him intimately. You are not bearing the likeness of the 6th. You are only bearing the likeness of the 5. Then one turns to me and tells me all that I have ever known. I go back in my mind's eye, and reason tells me that all through my life I have always accepted the limitation of my senses. I have always looked upon them as fact. In morning, noon, and night, I have borne witness to this acceptance. Neville's talking here about how we are limited by our senses. We have been our whole world, our whole life, limited to the senses, and we have borne witness to this acceptance. Reason tells me I have only known these 5 from the time I was born. Now I would like to step outside the limitation of my senses, but I have not yet found within myself the courage to assume I am what these 5 would deny that I am. So here I remain, conscious of my task, but without the courage to step beyond the limitations of my senses and that which my reason denies. He tells these, I have meat ye not know of. I am the bread that droppeth down from heaven. I am the wine. I know what I want to be, and because I am bread, I feast upon it. I assume that I am, and instead of feasting upon the fact that I am in this room talking to you, and you are listening to me, and that I am in Los Angeles, I feast upon the fact that I am elsewhere, and I walk here as though I were elsewhere. And gradually I become what I feast upon. Very simply put, Neville's talking about the limitations of the senses. In that story, the 5 husbands represent the 5 physical senses, and how morning, noon, and night we are bearing witness to what is being impregnated or impressed, and that we have always done this and always accepted it as true without second thought. And if we are to now step outside of the limitation of those 5 senses, we would start to experience that 4th dimension where all things exist, where any experience can be had, Even if I'm sitting here physically in my room in California, I can close my eyes right now and be somewhere else entirely. And I could shut it out so much to the point where that can feel so real to me. My imaginal senses can be just as strong as the physical ones, and both will bear fruit. Whichever one is impregnated will bear fruit. Let's keep going. Here he talks about personal stories. He has two personal stories, one being very famous and familiar. But Neville says, let me give you two personal stories. When I was a boy, I lived in a very limited environment in a little island called Barbados. Feed for animals was very, very scarce and very expensive because we had to import it. I am one of a family of 10 children, and my grandmother lived with us, making 13 at the table. Time and again, I can remember my mother saying to the cook in the early part of the week, I want you to put away 3 ducks for Sunday's dinner. That meant she would take from the flock in the yard 3 ducks and coop them up in a very small cage and feed them, stuff them morning, noon, and night with corn and all the things she wanted the ducks to feast upon. This was an entirely different diet from what we regularly fed the ducks, because we kept those birds alive by feeding them fish. We kept them alive and fat on fish because fish were very cheap and plentiful. But you could not eat a bird that fed upon fish, not as you or I like a bird. The cook would take 3 ducks, put them in the cage, and for 7 days stuff them with corn, sour milk, and all the things we wanted to taste in the birds. Then when they were killed and served for dinner, 7 days later, they were luscious, milk-fed, corn-fed birds. But occasionally the cook forgot to put away the birds, and my father, knowing we were having ducks, and believing that she had carried out the command, did not send anything else for dinner. And 3 fish came to the table. You could not touch these birds, for they were so much the embodiment of what they fed upon. Again, he's getting into the deeper meaning here. Man is a psychological being, a thinker. It is not what he feeds upon physically, but what he feeds upon mentally that he becomes. We become the embodiment of that which we mentally feed upon. Now those ducks could not be fed corn in the morning and fish in the afternoon and something else at night. It had to be a complete change of diet. In our case, we cannot have a little bit of meditation in the morning, curse at noon, and do something else in the evening. We have to go on a mental diet. For a week, we must completely change our mental food. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are of good report. If there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. All right. A few important things to note there. Again, Neville's using a personal story of his to talk about mental diet. This is about we are what we ruminate on. We are what we feed ourselves mentally. So all the conversations that we're having, all of the things that we are tolling over and just mulling over throughout the day-to-day, it's not enough to just do a little bit of meditation here, maybe a couple minutes of affirmations there. And, here we also are cursing and freaking out. We're very inconsistent with our diet. And Neville's saying, well, you cannot expect to be changed if you are to have this inconsistent, sporadic diet. There needs to be the basis of which you are thinking must change. The thoughts must change. The reactions must change. Not by force, but we are what we eat, physically and mentally. Let's keep going. And then he goes on to tell the famous story of Barbados, going to Barbados with his mentor, Abdullah. This was the first big successful manifestation that Neville Goddard had. Some of these excerpts are too funny. Abdullah was he was an Ethiopian rabbi, and he was the definition of badass. He did not care. He had no thoughts to give. He did what he wanted. He drank. He smoked. He was merry. He didn't let anything stop him because he knew that the only limitations that existed are in here. So he goes on to talk about how he met Abdullah, with whom I studied Hebrew for 5 years. Was really the beginning of the eating of all my superstitions. When I went to Abdullah, I was filled with superstitions. I could not eat meat. I could not eat fish. I could not eat chicken. I could not eat any of these things that were living in the world. I did not drink. I did not smoke. And I was making a tremendous effort to live a celibate life. Abdullah said to me, I am not going to tell you you are crazy, Neville, but you are, you know. All these things are stupid. But I could not believe they were stupid. So Abdullah's calling him out for his superstitions and all of his limiting beliefs, which in another lecture, Neville said that Abdullah referred to those limiting beliefs as quibbles. Like, we have too many quibbles. You know, we try to be perfect. We can't do this. We have to do that. Abdullah didn't believe in any of that. None of that. So he goes on to talk about how in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, Neville wanted to go home to Barbados. And he came to Abdullah and said, I want to go to Barbados. Abdullah said, if you want to go, Neville, you have gone. It was a very strange language. I am in New York City on 72nd Street, and he tells me I have gone to Barbados. I said to him, what do you mean I have gone, Abdullah? He answered, do you really want to go? I answered, yes. He then said to me, as you walk through this door, now you are not walking on 72nd Street. You are walking on palm-lined streets, coconut-lined streets. This is Barbados. Do not ask me how you are going to go. You are in Barbados. You do not say how when you are there. You are there. Now you walk as though you were there. Neville goes on to talk about his very much wavering and fears and how he could not even begin to believe that. He was not the kind of person with whom you could argue, not Abdullah. 2 weeks later, I was no nearer my goal than on the day I first told him I wanted to go to Barbados. I said to him, Ab, I trust you implicitly, but here is one time I cannot see how it is going to work. I have not one penny towards my journey. I began to explain. You know what he did? He was as black as the ace of spades, my old friend Abdullah, with his turbaned head. As I sat in his living room, he rose from his chair and went towards his study, and he slammed the door, which was not an invitation to follow him. As he went through the door, he said to me, I have said all that I have to say. On the 3rd of December, I stood before Abdullah and told him again I was no nearer my trip. He repeated his statement. You are in Barbados. So he goes on to explain how he received a telegram from his brother that he had to come out for Christmas, that all of the family would be there. So he did wind up going to Barbados in a way that he would not have been able to conceive. And when he found out he was going to be taking 3rd class because all the 1st class spots were taken, he came back to tell Abdullah, all excited, Abdullah, it worked. I'm going to Barbados and I'm going 3rd class. Abdullah said to him, what do you mean 3rd class? You already went to Barbados and you went 1st class. Well, when Neville came to board the ship, somebody had canceled in 1st class, and so he got upgraded, and sure enough, Neville went 1st class to Barbados. And that is the famous story. His first so-called big manifestation, at least that he shared. And he shares these stories again to sort of really emphasize the point of you have to think in that dimensionally greater self with that dimensionally greater mind. You have to use that fourth dimensional thinking because you're very limited. You're limited to the 3D. As far as your physical senses, they are limited to what they can tell you and what is possible for you. We're not going to know. If we try to use the very limited thinking natural mind, we're going to keep ourselves stuck. We need to use the spiritual mind, the mind of Christ. That is the imagination. That is the ability to conceive of or perceive or have or be anything that we want to be, no matter what. Neville continues. I came back walking this earth a completely transformed person. From that day, which was in February 1934, I began to live more and more. I cannot honestly tell you I have always succeeded. My many mistakes in this world, my many failures would convict me if I told you that I have so completely mastered the movements of my attention that I can, at all times, remain faithful to the idea I want to embody. Yes, even Neville was not perfect. But I can say, with the ancient teacher, although I seem to have failed in the past, I move on and strive day after day to become that which I want to embody in this world. Suspend judgment, refuse to accept what reason and the senses now dictate, and if you remain faithful to the new diet, you will become the embodiment of the ideal to which you remain faithful. If there is one place in the world that is unlike my little island of Barbados, it is New York City. In Barbados, the tallest building is 3 stories, and the streets are lined with palm trees and coconut trees and all sorts of tropical things. In New York City, you must go to a park to find a tree. Yet I had to walk the streets of New York as though I walked the streets of Barbados. To one's imagination, all things are possible. I walked, feeling that I was actually walking the streets of Barbados, and in that assumption I could almost smell the odor of the coconut-lined lanes. I began to create within my mind's eye the atmosphere I would physically encounter were I in Barbados. As I remained faithful to this assumption, somebody canceled passage, and I received it. My brother in Barbados, who never thought of my coming home, has the commanding urge to write me a strange letter. He has never dictated me, but this time he dictated, and thought that he originated the idea of my visit. I went home and had 3 heavenly months, returned first class, and brought back quite a sum of cash in my pocket, a gift. My trip, had I paid for it, would have been $3,000. Yet I did it without a nickel in my pocket. I have ways ye not know of. My ways are past finding out. The dimensionally greater self took my assumption as the command and influenced the behavior of my brother to write that letter, influenced the behavior of someone to cancel that first-class passage, and did all the things necessary that I would tend toward the production of the idea with which I was identified. My old friend Abdullah simply said to me, "You are in Barbados, Neville. You wanted to be there. Wherever you want to be, there you are. Live as though you are, and that you shall be." So those stories naturally are just beautiful reminders of the power of imagination and suspending and denying the senses. Neville had to walk New York City, the streets of New York City, which is about as polar opposite that you can get from Barbados. A small, sleepy little island where the tallest buildings are 3 stories. So when people often ask me, "Missy, how do I ignore my 3D?" Do as Neville did there. In your mind, you are walking as though it were. Not needing to lie to yourself, not needing to be delulu. There's no need to be delulu. But in your mind, in your imagination, use as many of the imaginal senses as you can to capture the feeling of it and what it would be like. Let's continue. These are the two outlooks in the world possessed by every man. I do not care who you are. Every child born of woman, regardless of race, nation, or creed, possesses two distinct outlooks on the world. You are either the natural man who receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, because to you, in the natural focus, they are foolishness unto you. Or you are the spiritual man who perceiveth things outside of the limitations of your senses, because all things are now realities in a dimensionally larger world. There is no need to wait 4 months to harvest. That was another thing that's important. You do not need to wait for your harvest because the harvest is now, as in the dimensionally larger world, in imagination. You experience what you want to experience now. You do not need to wait for it to show up in 3D. That's what that means. You are either the woman of Samaria or Jesus at the well. You are the man waiting on the 5 porches for the disturbance and someone to push him in, or you are the one who can command yourself to rise and walk in spite of others who wait. Are you the man behind the tombstones in the cemetery, waiting and begging not to be clean, because you do not want to be cleansed of your prejudices? One of the most difficult things for men to give up is his superstitions, his prejudice. He holds on to those as though they were treasure of treasures. This is true. You cannot be disturbed when you feel you are what you want to be, because if you feel you are what you want to be, you are satisfied in the assumption. To others who judge superficially, you seem no longer to desire. So to the desire, our damsel is dead. They think you have lost your ambition because you no longer discuss your secret ambition. You have completely adjusted yourself to the idea. You have assumed that you are what you want to be. Basically, he's saying you may not be like pining for it or longing for it or talking about it incessantly. When you already have something, it almost feels like you've lost your ambition or it just seems normal to you now. That's what that means. You can either be attentive to the limitations and feed these and make them mountains, or you can be attentive to your desires. But to become attentive, you must assume you are already that which you want to be. Although today we speak of a 3rd dimensional and 4th dimensional focus, do not think for one moment these ancient teachers were not fully conscious of these 2 distinct centers of thought within the minds of all men. They personified these 2, and they tried to show man that the only thing which robs him of the man he could be is habit. Although it is not law, every psychologist will tell you that habit is the most inhibiting force in the world. It completely restricts man and binds him and makes him totally blind to what otherwise he should be. Yeah. Habit is the reason we are where we are and why it feels so damn difficult to change. Begin now to mentally see and feel yourself as that which you want to be, and feast upon that sensation morning, noon, and night. I have scoured the Bible for a time interval that is longer than 3 days and have not found it. Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. If I could completely saturate my mind with one sensation and walk as though it already were a fact, I am promised, and I cannot find any denial of it in this great book, that I do not need more than a 3-day diet if I remain faithful to it. But I must be honest about it. If I change my diet in the course of the day, I extend the time interval. You ask me, but how do I know about the interval? You yourself determine the interval. We have today in our modern world a little word which confuses most of us. I know it confused me until I dug deeper. The word is action. Action is supposed to be the most fundamental thing in the world. It is not an atom, it is more fundamental. It is not a part of an atom, like an electron. It is more fundamental than that. They call it the fourth dimensional unit. The most fundamental thing in the world is action. You ask, what is action? Our physicists tell us that it is energy multiplied by time. We become more confused and say, energy multiplied by time? What does that mean? They answer, there is no response to a stimulus, no matter how intense a stimulus, unless it endures for a certain length of time. There must be a minimum endurance to the stimulus, or there is no response. On the other hand, there is no response to time unless there is a minimum degree of intensity. Today, the most fundamental thing in the world is called action, or simply energy multiplied by time. The Bible gives it 3 days. The duration is 3 days for the response in this world. If I would now assume I am what I want to be, and if I'm faithful to it and walk as though it were, the very longest stretch given for its realization is 3 days. If there's something tonight you would really want in this world, then experience it in imagination, what you would experience in the flesh were you to realize your goal, and deafen your ears and blind your eyes to all that denies the reality of your assumption. The purpose of these lessons is to remind you of the law of your own being, the law of consciousness. You are that law. You were only unconscious of its operation. You fed and kept alive the things you did not wish to express within this world. Take my challenge and put this philosophy to the test. If it does not work, you should not use it as a comforter. If it is not true, you must completely discard it. I know it is true. You will not know until you either try to prove it or disprove it. Too many of us have joined isms, and we are afraid to put them to the test because we feel we might fail. And then, where are we? Not really wanting to know the truth concerning it, we hesitate to be bold enough to put it to the test. You say, I know it would work in some other way. I do not want to really test it. While I have not yet disproved it, I can still be comforted by it. Now do not fool yourself. Do not think for 1 second, be that you are wise. Prove or disprove this law. I know that if you attempt to disprove it, you will prove it, and I will be richer for your proving it, not in dollars, not in things, but because you have become the living fruit of what I believe I am teaching in this world. It is far better to have you a successful, satisfied person after 5 days of instruction than to have you go out dissatisfied. I hope you will be bold enough to challenge this instruction and either prove or disprove it. And he talks once again about the technique, basically going into sats. 2 techniques. Imagine it in a scene or condense the feeling into a single general feeling. And we've gone over those, both of those more in the previous lesson. If you want more videos on sats and the lullaby method, as it's called, isn't it wonderful? I have made videos about those as well. But basically, he's telling his followers here to just, this is how you perform the action of planting that seed, thinking fourth dimensionally. Now we will go into the silence, as he does finish in every lecture. So a lot there to digest at the very end. But one of my favorite quotes of his, he says here at the very end, "Take my challenge and put this philosophy to the test. Too many of us have joined isms, and we are afraid to test them because we feel we might fail. And then, now what? Not really wanting to know the truth, we hesitate to be bold enough to put this to the test. Basically, it's easier for a lot of us to hold on to these teachings for comfort. We're too scared to actually test this because what if we fail? What if it proves to not be true? Then what? Then I have nothing." Neville's saying here, if you are doing this, if you are holding on to this law for comfort instead of actually proving or disproving it, do not think for 1 second you are being wise. Prove or disprove this law. It is that simple. He talks about the interval of 3 days. There's a lot of back and forth about whether he meant literally 3 days, as in 3 days in the physical world. He references in later lectures in his books, 3 is it's an allegory. It is meant to be taken figuratively speaking, not literally. It can be 3 days. We can certainly see things show up within 3 days if we remain faithful and steadfast to our idea, to what we desire. But the ultimate point here is that we need to start thinking more fourth dimensionally. We need to stop being subdued and stifled by the physical senses and by what reason and logic tells us is true or possible or real for us. Which mind are you using? The two minds that of all men born of woman, there's the carnal mind or the natural mind, the mind of man, or the mind of Christ, the spiritual mind, the fourth dimension of mind. Which one are you using? And choose wisely. I hope you guys enjoyed today's breakdown. I hope you guys enjoyed that lesson 3, thinking fourth dimensionally. Next week, we will be diving into lesson 4, which is no one to change but self, I believe. Yep. No one to change but self. That one is also an incredibly important one. Arguably, I mean, all 5 lessons are important, of course, but lesson 3 and lesson 4 are arguably my favorite because they really do break it down in as simple terms as possible. Everything that we need to understand and implement this law. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend, wherever you may be in this world. Thank you all so much who reached out, sending well wishes. I am feeling better. I got a little bit of stuffiness left, as you might be able to hear, but otherwise I am doing a lot better. But much love to each and every one of you, and I look forward to seeing you here in lesson 4. Until next time, guys. Bye.